Some slight apologies before we begin. Essentially, this essay should have come first, but I only went through basically the video essay that's really solidified this mythology of Zack as a kind of Randian and as a fascist. To be fair, it is referenced by Maggie Mayfish and others, so they give it a lot of credit, but I've only had recent time to really look at it. And I am going to agree partly with what they're saying, because what they're saying about Rorschach, a major character in Watchmen, the graphic novel that Zack Snyder adapted, is true. I think most of what they're saying is correct. But then, when they start trying to build on that, that's when it all goes haywire, and what they're saying just basically slips into complete nonsense. But in terms of mythologies, that's, I think, where this mythology began. Because while there were a few people who looked at 300 and things like that as fascist, and there were a few essays, in terms of today, this video essay probably is the one that really just got the ball rolling. And from then on in, Maggie Mayfish, Just Right, and others have sort of dogpiled in much lesser YouTubers, and it just seems now a complete solidified fact that Zack Snyder is some kind of fascist. So we're going to go through what they're going to say with Rorschach. Again, we're going to partly agree, but then we're going to hopefully correct a lot of misconceptions that they've put into the video essay, because this part is strong, but it is very problematic.
Ass-kissing hero worship, but really nothing affects the movie as much as the reframing of Rorschach as a cool, edgy anti-hero. It's worth saying again, Rorschach is a bad dude. You're not supposed to like Rorschach.
He's a cringe weirdo who writes angry scribbles about how unfair everything is in his diary. He says out loud, in words,
"You might as well call me a Nazi."
He defends the comedian being a rapist like it's no big deal. What a weird coincidence that the movie treats Rorschach like he's right too.
I wanted to make this like, yeah, this is what Batman would be in the real world. But I had forgotten that actually, to a lot of comic fans, that smelling, not having a girlfriend, these are actually kind of heroic. So actually, sort of, Rorschach became the most popular character in Watchmen. I meant him to be a bad example, but I have people come up to me in the street saying, I am Rorschach, that is my story. And I'll be thinking, yeah, great, can you just keep away from me? Never come anywhere near me as long as I live?
It's pretty laughably wrong to make this guy your gruff, tough voice of the night.
Slept all day. Awoken at 4:37. Landlady complaining about the smell. She has 5 children, all by different fathers. I am sure she cheats on welfare.
What a cool guy. It was something often said that Watchmen was unadaptable, that it could never be made into a movie or a TV show, and maybe there's something to that, but if there was one single thing not to do, it would be to make Rorschach cool.
We'll get into it more later, but Snyder's Watchmen almost perfectly inverts the meaning of the original story, which, as I've been saying, is a pretty good lesson in how an adaptation is so much more about what the person adapting it wants to be than what the source material is.
And I bring this up because when I try to
Alright, so what they were saying is mostly correct. Moore did in fact make Rorschach into a kind of parody of Ayn Rand. There was this comic book artist called Stephen Ditko, and he became a huge Randian in the 1960s. Long story short, Ditko is the co-creator of Spider-Man. He did plenty of other things, but him working on Spider-Man is his most famous work. And Ditko was a diehard Randian. He took it all the way, and he created this character called Mr. A, who thinks that there is only good and evil should be punished. Which, of course, it sounds a lot like Rorschach. And Moore, not liking Rand, and I think not understanding Rand completely, took basically the skeleton of Mr. A and applied it to Rorschach, but changed a few things slightly. And that is true, and I agree with them that, yes, Zack is not portraying Rorschach like he's portrayed it in the comic book. In the comic book, it's not obvious, but if you read it carefully enough, you will gather that Rorschach is basically a fascist, because he defends and sticks up for the comedian, and the comedian is obviously a Nazi. He is a very extreme fascist. Rorschach is not as extreme or as explicit, but if you read him carefully in his actions, you'll put it together. But in the movie, we don't know why, he did repress this more harsh side of Rorschach and made Rorschach appear much more reasonable than he really is. So from the movie, he does appear to be, yes, very crazy at times and very skewed in his thinking, but essentially he does come off as a very noble, tragic superhero. And that's not true in the books. He mostly is and begins and ends as a pretty psychotic maniac. He does noble things, he does good things in particular, But Moore never really lets us forget his entire world viewpoint is very disturbed. But the movies simplified this enormously, and they don't frame him like they do in the comic book. So I agree mostly with what they're basically saying with Rorschach. However, it's what then proceeds where things get very problematic. Because you understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, well, there's fascist imagery in 300. Rorschach is treated like a good pro-fascist in Watchmen, and in Man of Steel and BVS. There's this kind of elitism that looks down on ordinary people. And Zack has admitted, as indeed he has, that he likes some of Rand's work, so let's put it together. You're mixing apples and oranges. The fact that there may be pro-fascist imagery in 300 may be owed to Frank Miller, so that's not Zack. He's just being faithful in terms of adapting things. In terms of Rorschach, that's probably the strongest case, where he definitely softened Rorschach's fascism. I don't think he did it for money, because we can see clearly that Zack is willing to make a financial sacrifice. He did all of Justice League for free. He wasn't getting paid any money. So he's willing to take a hit financially. I can only conclude this is probably his sincere interpretation of Rorschach, which, by the way, I shared for a while, because Watchmen is a very complex, deep book. It's done in a very documentary style. Alan Moore never editorializes and tells you, hey, this guy's an evil fascist. You have to read it at a very sophisticated level. I'm not going to go through my interpretation of Watchmen because that would be very lengthy, both in terms of the comic and the adaptation. But for me, I think Zack just read it at a very simplified level, and that's what I don't like about the adaptation. I understand where he's coming from, but that's simply not the story Alan Moore wanted to tell. So insofar as you like Watchmen, that's fine, but it's not a faithful adaptation. It's very much Zack's interpretation of these characters, and his interpretation is framing them perhaps as much more good or noble or powerful than they really are in the comic. So I agree with them that yes, Zack is reframing Rorschach as much more heroic than he really is. But does that make him a fascist? No, but you can say he was making some politically dubious decisions. As for the rest of the canon, I've already had some videos on this, so I'm just going to condense my arguments that you're really just putting a lot of circumstantial evidence where it appears that Superman is not saving people, and you're ignoring the cases where they do help people, they do feel altruism, they do feel a sense of larger responsibility, and that is clearly not Randian, that is not fascistic, that, again, may be very questionable, it may be questionable on many levels in terms of masculinity and power and all those things. Those are perfectly legitimate issues, but that is very far from him being a Randian or being a Randian fascist or him being a libertarian fascist Randian who's covertly putting in propaganda to fool the mass audience. I see no evidence of that. But Watchmen is probably the strongest case where he is deliberately and deceptively framing things to get to a certain result. Why he did it, I cannot say we still know definitively, but it has provided, I think, because it was done a little covertly, a lot of material for those people who want to see Zack as a fascist. I think I can just say he definitely did reframe Rorschach. So insofar as you think Rorschach is a fascist, and I think that's a reasonable opinion, yes, we are left with a very big quandary in terms of, did he do this deliberately? Did he do this absentmindedly? Did he understand the ramifications? We're going to be debating that a long time, but I think this is an exception to the rule. And in most other cases, he is treating fascism mostly negatively and mostly from a neutral stance. He's not endorsing it. Rorschach is probably the most difficult case in terms of looking at Snyder's canon. Alright, this has been a video essay on the origins of the myth of Zack Snyder as a proto-fascist. Thank you for listening.